Good morning and welcome to Ekata's webinar, Preparing for Black Friday during COVID-19. We're going to take this next 45 minutes or so and talk about everything COVID-19, Black Friday, the intersection of those things, and really how it relates to fraud, how we're going to help you prepare for that this coming holiday season. Let's get right into it. We're going to be going over today a couple of sort of major topics. First thing I'm going to talk about is the effect of COVID-19 on digital economies. Then we're going to talk about the effect of COVID-19 on 2020's Black Friday. I'm going to take you back a little bit of time, show you what Ekata has seen, sort of a pseudo Black Friday, if you will, early on in COVID-19 and quarantine. And then we're going to end today on the global usage of email and phone in transactions and sort of some changes we've seen there from Ekata's perspective over the past 6 to 8 months. I want to give you a warm welcome. My name is Noelle Wiggins. I am Ekata's Data Acquisitions Manager. I am presenting to you this morning from beautiful Seattle, Washington on the West Coast. So if you're joining from the West Coast, good morning to you. If you're joining from the United States, good morning. To all of our joiners from Europe, good afternoon to you. Thank you for being here. Due to ongoing quarantine and lockdowns, we're going to be doing this from my home this morning, as opposed to where we normally do it in the office. As Ekata's Data Acquisitions Manager, one of the major roles that I serve at Ekata is to look at how customers are interacting with our data, how end users are using attributes. I look at really broad fraud patterns and I say, what are the sort of things that we can do to better serve you as a customer, better serve our clients, to show them sort of, what fraud looks like and how to identify that. One of the big things that I do is acquire new data sets. And these are truth sets in our identity graph that we then use to compare actual transactions against known identity linkages. So for myself, that would be Noelle Wiggins and my phone number and my email address and my shipping address. And then when I'm transacting on any given e-commerce website or online lending or travel and hospitality, all of that information comes through to Ekata. And on that side, they compare, what we know about Noelle to be true versus what this transaction says, and then present to you whether that's a risky or non-risky transaction. One of the major things that I get to look at, though, is sort of broadly, what are some of the trends we're seeing around our data? What are some of the trends we're seeing as end users are submitting their transactions? What are we seeing in terms of query volumes? And so over the past 8 months or so, I have been observing Ekata's sort of network on a really global scale. And incredibly, we've seen some really fascinating trends. I think at the very beginning, we didn't know how large this was going to be. And certainly Asia was responding a little bit different than Europe was responding versus how the United States was responding. And the response was pretty fragmented. Starting around March, though, this became a truly global response, right? And so when you have these sort of massive global economic trends, you can actually kind of zoom out and look at that over Ekata's transaction volumes and our confidence scores and say, what are some of the global patterns and global trends we're seeing? So I'm going to just start by walking you through our online volume trends. When I talk about volume here, what I'm talking about is the number of transactions, the number of queries that are coming through Ekata's system. This is a little quick graph I've made for you. You can see the green line is 2019 volume, the purple line is 2020 volume, and there's about a 40% difference between these two on this particular graph. We've controlled this pretty heavily for Ekata's growth and for seasonality and that sort of stuff, but 40% is approximately what we expect to see year over year growth for Ekata's volume. So January through March of 2020 was very similar to what we saw January through March of 2019 with that sort of increased volume. I'm going to zoom out on this just a little bit. So this is January all the way through the end of August. I was going to have a poll and say, can you guess what happened next with that purple line? But I assume you probably have an idea of the graph I'm going to show you. You see March 16 hits and we just have this massive increase in volume. And you start seeing these really interesting local maxima happen a couple of times. to be clear, this graph has been pretty significantly smoothed. We used an exponential smoothing calculation to sort of take away some of the noise and some of the day-to-day granularity. But you're still getting these really fascinating peaks happening. And I just want to talk about those for a moment, because when we look at Ekata's query volumes from a global perspective, we generally don't expect to see the entire global economy moving in sort of the same direction, right? You have sort of these localized events, these regional events, but having sort of this massive trend overall across the entire globe is not a normal thing to happen. And it, first of all, goes to show what a global response truly was to COVID-19, but also how the global digital economy is changing. In sort of the democratization of internet and computing power across the world allows everybody who is affected by this to respond in similar ways in their transaction volumes. So we're going to just talk about a couple of these things. Again, this is normalized and this is smooth. So the actual dates that I'm pointing out are not necessarily the day that we had these peaks. It's a little bit broader than that. But you sort of see that initial peak beginning right around March 18th. This is unsurprising, right? A week earlier, March 11th, COVID-19 was declared a pandemic by the World Health Organization. And by March 18th, the first major wave of lockdowns have hit at this point. Italy, France, Spain are leading the charge in Europe with sort of the domestic lockdowns. Australia and the US have implemented at this point really strong travel restrictions and quarantine policies. And so that's sort of the point that you see the global response kick in. If we were to zoom out and take apart Southeast Asia versus Europe versus the United States, up to this point, you would have seen a slightly varying response. And that sort of averaged out to approximately normal volumes globally. This is the point that the entire global economy begins responding in a really interesting way. The next sort of local maxima you have there is May 7th. This is the point that most major economies have rolled out really significant relief packages and stimulus packages. This is also an interesting point in sort of the lockdown narrative, because this is the moment that many countries are discussing easing up on lockdowns, maybe easing up on shutdowns. Even as the toll continues to increase, there's sort of thought that maybe they can bring this back. And then July 30th, close in our memory because it's early September right now, discussions begin anew for new lockdowns, and you see another sort of local maxima happen at this point, topping out over where everything else has been. And of course, this sort of makes sense because the online trend is just, we're going to increase, right? We're seeing sort of an unusual increase in the amount of queries coming through to Ekata. And at its very most, that's 189% more than what we saw at the same time last year. This isn't really normal for what we see. The only times that we see this sort of significant peaks in spending are around, really big spending holidays like Black Friday. We'll get to that in a second. But we haven't really seen that globally before for a non-holiday, non-spending related item. So let's talk then about that big spending day, that big spending holiday. That is Black Friday. I don't know about you. I've been reading for years all these articles that come out and they say, Black Friday is dead and retail is dead. And I think we've all sort of laughed at that a little bit. But certainly this year, there's a lot more truth to that. Black Friday is not going to look the same that it has in the past. But Black Friday is an interesting one for us to think about when we position it relative to COVID-19. Because what we were just looking at with COVID-19, this global, this broad scale, is you've got a single event that moves the entire world economy. The only comparable event is Black Friday that moves the entire global economy. In the past, Black Friday was a very US focused holiday. Today, it's not a US only ordeal. We consider it to be a global phenomena just from looking at our data. And certainly it has huge popularity in Europe. It's quickly catching on in Asia as digital penetration increases there. So we have two global events. We've got a global pandemic, unprecedented. We have a global shopping holiday, Black Friday, very normal, very standard. And we've gotten to a point where we can see pretty clearly what Black Friday looks like and what we can expect to see. So this is a chart that green line is the volume of queries and transactions that Ekata is seeing in 2019. I was going to ask you guys if you could identify which moment on this graph was Black Friday without an x-axis, but I thought it was a little too obvious. Black Friday is that huge peak that you see there, that really interesting local maxima. I've actually altered the y-axis here over what you were seeing previously to accommodate for this huge jump that you have in spending. Black Friday is pretty standard for us. What we see is that there's that huge initial increase, and then for the rest of the holiday season, query volumes remain elevated over what we generally see for the rest of the year. And then starting in January, they dip back down to about normal levels. So the question then is, what should we expect to see for Black Friday in 2020? So this is that same volume graph that I just showed you of what we've seen in 2020 so far. That's that purple line in volumes. And one of the things you'll notice is those sort of local maxima, while not quite to the level that Black Friday was last year, certainly are beginning to trend in a way that is significantly higher than what we would normally expect from sort of a Black Friday situation. And the question then is, will Black Friday follow its historical trend? Will that massive increase right around the end of November still happen? You have that huge local maxima, and then will it stay elevated through the rest of the year? Or are we going to see a slightly different phenomena this year? And I wanted to pose this question to you. I know the people that are on the line right now, you are incredibly well aware of the interesting fraud patterns that are happening right now, the interesting buying behavior and digital economic behavior that we're seeing. And so I want to give you a moment to answer this. You'll see a poll pop up. It's asking, what growth do you personally expect in 2020 Black Friday over 2019? And while this question is just around what do you expect Ekata is going to see in transaction volumes, I would encourage you to sort of back out from it, look a little bit more broadly even, and say, you know, what are we expecting? Are we expecting that same trend, something like a 20% growth over that peak in Black Friday? Are we expecting that trend to stay? In the past, Black Friday has grown approximately 15 to 20% year over year at that peak, right? I think last year was the most significant, something like 17% digitally growing over the previous year. And that's important. That's really critical for us to understand, because when we're looking at, you know, sort of how are we going to adjust our fraud models? How are we going to prepare our manual review agents? What are we going to look at in terms of our confidence score and our modeling and our risk? That volume is really important to note, because that volume has an effect on how fraud happens. That volume has an effect on how we deal with fraud. All right, we got the results in. I'm fascinated by this. So 38% of you said you expect that same sort of 20% year over year growth to happen at Black Friday. And then consensus is 50% saying moderate. We're expecting 10 to 20% growth over 2019. And to be clear, that 10 to 20% is what we've seen in the past. That's very standard that we're going to expect that. Now, at the risk of being incorrect, I have a little bit of I have a prediction. We'll come back at the end of December. We'll see if I was correct on this. I expect that we are going to see very modest growth. And it looks like 6% of you agree with me on that. We'll see if I'm correct. I expect that we're going to see modest growth in 2020 over 2019's Black Friday. I have a couple reasons for thinking of this. One is that the sales for Black Friday are going to be moving forward to October. So many of the major retailers, Best Buy, Kohl's, Target, Walmart, who are not going to be open in person on Black Friday, are moving those sales forward. So whereas in the past you had an immediate economic impetus to purchase on that given day, that's going to be taken away, and you're going to sort of elongate this period of buying where people have an economic impetus to do so. On top of this, we see no sort of experiential component to Black Friday this year, and at least not an in-person experience. Right? We're not going to be going to the stores. We're not going to be hanging around. We're not going to be doing it with our friends this year. And so that sort of initial peak where there's that experience is not going to happen. On top of that, when we see increased transaction volumes at Ekata, that correlates really nicely with global e-commerce sales, sort of that spending growth. So what we see in this graph, when people's spending has increased so significantly from what we expected it to, you're looking at a 40% year-over-year growth globally. When you're looking at peaks at like 189%, you kind of extrapolate that out to, significantly more buying than we have in the past. If you think about a person's economic situation being sort of a zero-sum game, the same amount of money that they would normally spend in a year that was sort of backloaded to Black Friday has now been front-loaded to Q2 and Q3. And so they might have less to spend on Black Friday, and therefore the transaction volumes will be less. That is just my prediction. It looks like 6% of you agree with me and say it'll be less than 10% over 2019. Interestingly, I want to point out 6% of you said that there will be no growth over 2019. And certainly from sort of a global digital economy perspective, we hope that's not the case. But I think there have been some really interesting cases made for this. So one of the questions that we asked was, why do we care that volumes are increased? Why do we even want to try to predict what we'll see in terms of volumes? And the reason is that volume and spending pattern has a really significant impact on what is called confidence score for Ekata, what for you'll consider to be your risk models. I want to take just a second, if you're not familiar, and talk about what Ekata's confidence score is, because this is critical for the graphs that you're about to see. Confidence score is a derived score that we have. It is 0 to 500, 0 being really good customer, very, very low risk, 500 being every alarm bell on earth has gone off, really, really high risk. Don't do this. We generally don't see a 500. That would be the worst fraudster of all time, right? But you've got sort of the scale, 0 to 500. Generally, higher score, higher risk. Lower score, lower risk. This is a really important score for Ekata, and it's really important for us to sort of think through what this means kind of globally, right? This is powered by extremely sophisticated machine learning models and data analysis. And if I can just give a really quick plug and shout out to Ekata's data science team that works on this constantly. This takes in sort of these dynamic data elements, that graph data I was talking about earlier. That's what I'm really focused on, is bringing in sort of these authoritative matching data sets. Ask the question, does this name match this name? Does the transaction shipping address match this person's actual shipping address? Those questions. And then it also takes into account all this network information, which when you're looking really broadly at Ekata is saying, do we see sort of fraudulent behavior? Do we see unusual patterns with this transaction? Do we see unusual patterns with this entity? It takes all of that incredible information and it boils it down into this one super powerful score that then says, how risky is this transaction? So when we're looking at confidence score, this is the average confidence score for about Q4 of 2019. Interesting. If you remember that past graph that I showed you of the volumes, it was really easy to pick out where Black Friday was, right? Should be the same in this one. You see that really significant dip happen near the end of November. Here's what's going on here. So what we did is we took all of the confidence scores that are coming through the network and we did some normalization on them. We removed some outliers. We tried to get only accounts that were super representative of single use case. And then we looked at sort of what is the average, what is the normal confidence score that we're seeing over this period of time. Confidence score, historically speaking, has decreased during Black Friday. And so again, this is a little different than how maybe you would think of confidence score as a customer. Each of our customers sets a threshold sort of for what is a risky transaction, what is not. If they're using a rules-based model, if it's a machine learning model, right, it becomes, confidence score becomes a factor in that. Confidence score contributes to that. But just for our visual purposes, we're going to look at it this way and say, everything in the red is probably higher risk transactions. Everything in green, probably pretty low risk transactions. And what you see here is, over most of the year, you've got, moderate transactions from an average perspective. Most of your transactions are going to be good. And then those couple that are really bad up near the 500 are going to skew that average up. What's incredible about this is what's so different, is when you see Black Friday happen, confidence scores just take a dive. That's a good thing. That means that we're seeing more transactions coming through that are less risky, because fraud remains approximately the same over the period when we're looking at this globally, when we're looking across all merchants. And so when you see that really significant dip happen into that green zone, that's an interesting factor. The question is, what happened during COVID-19? I can answer that. Fascinating. When so I was watching this really closely at the beginning of quarantine, just trying to get an understanding sort of how Ekata was seeing people behave. And when I saw this dip happen, really mid-March, I was stunned, and I immediately made that first half of the graph here, because I was like, this looks to me like Black Friday. This looks like normal Black Friday behavior. So again, once again, you see that behavior. It takes this initial dive, really significant, and then the confidence scores remain low over some period afterwards. I chose to show you this section because it remains low for about the same period as it did after Black Friday in 2019. We usually see that up through December 31st, the end of the year, while people are still purchasing. It increased again after this to some moderate amount, back to approximately normal levels. But that initial dive is fascinating. It tells us a couple of things. First of all, this sort of panic buying and increased transaction volume that you saw very early on in COVID-19 really closely mirrors what you would normally see during Black Friday. On top of that, it tells us that we can still expect to see the same general trend in confidence score during a global pandemic that we do during a normal year in increased buying seasons. 2020 is a weird one. It's a different year than we're used to. And so anytime we can sort of say, these are the trends in the past that have held true, and these are the trends we can still expect to hold true, is important. And so the fact that we had increased levels of very, very good customers, approximately the same fraud, decreased confidence score, we could expect to still see that again in this coming Black Friday, that you'll once again see that sort of dip occur in confidence score, that increased likelihood that you're having good customers, more good customers come on, and adjust models and sort of adjust your review accordingly. Now we're going to switch gears a little bit. I have been talking for this entire past 20 minutes about a global perspective of the pandemic, a global perspective of confidence scores, a global perspective of transaction volumes. The reason I can do that is because Ekata is uniquely positioned as a cross-border product. Regardless of where you are on the earth, we can verify your identity. We can determine whether it is a high-risk transaction or a low-risk transaction, and give you some interesting data on how to respond to that transaction. We're going to switch gears a little bit though, and we're going to break this out into sort of two major regions. I'm going to talk about Europe and the United States sort of as a block, and then I'm going to really briefly talk about Southeast Asia. To start, we first have to understand the differing value of phone and email in identity verification. Email is a lot less likely than a phone to have sort of an authoritative link. So while Ekata is going to often tell you if somebody owns an email address, it's a lot harder to get that information versus a phone number, where in most countries, especially Southeast Asia, especially Europe, if you're going to go buy a phone, whether it's a prepaid phone or a postpaid phone, you're going to get a phone number. You have to link your identity to that. You have to link your name to that. And it's those sort of authoritative links that Ekata really relies on to say, yes, we know that this is Noelle Wiggins' phone number because the telco says she owns this phone number. There really is no alternative like that with email. And so when you look at the value of phone versus email, the way we assess them is really different. So phone metadata is really important. Prepaid versus postpaid. Phone owner is really important. And email owner is too, but what is particularly powerful about email as a data asset is actually its network features. And its network features, I'm talking about Ekata's identity network. That is, early on I talked about how we observe sort of the universe of transactions coming through. And we see patterns. We see patterns of how certain things are being used with other attributes. We're seeing patterns of when we first saw an attribute, that's email first seen. We're not looking at the email creation date. We're looking at when was that email first seen transacting online? When was that first used? Is this a disposable email? Is this an auto-generated email? And those are sort of the things that we look at there. As always, there's a graph component, that is that authoritative link. There's a network component, that's that behavioral aspect, and we're looking at both always. But when you sort of zoom out globally, email tends to be very, very powerful as a network signal. Phone also is very, very powerful as that graph signal, looking at those authoritative links. All this to say, the best case scenario, what we want to see is that a query contains both a phone and an email. That's like the gold standard, right? Because then we've got all the information. We can return so much more information with so much more fidelity. Southeast Asia is a huge digital region. We're going to talk about it very briefly because I think it's important to sort of understand how other regions are interacting with data attributes, how it looks different from Europe versus North America versus Latin America versus Asia, right? This is the graph of the past year or so of Southeast Asia's attribute mix. That purple line is the percent of queries that Ekata has observed that contain a phone number. That is, how many times were we sent a phone from a customer. And then the green line is the percent of queries that contain an email address. This is interesting. Email penetration in Southeast Asia is significantly lower than the rest of the world. And the reason for this is because that digital economy has developed a little bit later than the others, and it has been extremely mobile focused. And so where in sort of the US and the EU, early on, everybody had an email address. They did not have a mobile phone number because mobile phone numbers didn't exist yet. And so you sort of get this email primacy happening. Whereas in Southeast Asia, they come into the digital economy with mobile phones and with phone numbers and sort of choose to represent that first, right? And so it's long been believed, getting email in Southeast Asia just isn't possible. A lot of companies have chosen not to source for that because we just don't expect anybody to be submitting email to us. I want to point out, this is fascinating. Look at this overlap. We've got this really significant period where we're seeing a significant portion of queries coming through with both phone and email last year. That's amazing. That's really good because that increases our ability to validate because Ekata has put such huge emphasis and effort on sourcing for Southeast Asia and sourcing these emails. It dips back down, and we can talk about maybe reasons that occurred and that dip in email happens and goes back sort of to a status quo, back to normal levels. But what I think is important here is that email is still really, really critical for Southeast Asia. We can validate that. People can use that. We do see queries coming through over long periods that have a lot of emails in them. But when you look sort of at that more recent line, you see phone being the primary characteristic. It's really critical that we can validate phone super, super well. And phone usage is becoming more consistent during COVID-19, sort of around the globe. One of the things that I was surprised to see was that over quarantine, over lockdowns, globally, consumers have been increasing use of their mobile devices. And I don't know if you guys have an iPhone and it, at the end of the day, like tells you your screen time. It's really devastating to me because my screen time has increased during quarantine. And I was like, how is that possible? I'm not doing anything with my phone. I think the major thing is where a lot of people were doing things on their desktop, doing things on their computer because they were at work, because they had that readily available. Today, that sort of switched to, it's a lot easier to just grab the phone and go because I maybe am not on my desktop as often. And so new consumers, these are people who've never shopped online before, new consumers who are joining the digital economy for the first time are doing so in mass amounts from their smartphones. And that means that they will likely be choosing to create accounts with their phone number as the primary identifying attribute. That means that when they send us queries, that phone number will likely be included. And this is actually a really, really good thing because phone number, like we said before, has a more authoritative link to ownership than email does. And so we want to see really good phone number penetration in our queries. Of course, in an optimal situation, as you saw in Southeast Asia, we want both phone number and email. But if we're going to get phone number, we want to validate that phone number. We want to be able to give you incredible risk signals on that phone number. So this is the same graph you just saw for Southeast Asia, but this time it's for Europe and North America. I want you to notice something. There's some volatility here. It appears there's a little bit of seasonality. We've tried to remove that from this data set. A little bit of volatility around what percentage of the time we're seeing phone versus email included in a query. You'll notice email penetration in Europe and North America is actually a lot lower than in Southeast Asia. And this is surprising to a lot of people. Like I said before, the thought process being Southeast Asia has terrible email penetration, we're not going to see much. What we actually see in queries is that they're doing a little bit better over the long term than we are in Europe and North America in including that as a data asset. But I want to really show you where the stabilization is occurring to. I want you to put your attention here on everything after this line. What we see here is that the amount of queries coming through from Europe and North America with a phone number is really, really stable, hovering right around 90% since the beginning of March. That's really stabilized. Maybe we can attribute this to more people are on their phone, shopping from their phone, shopping online and putting their phone number in. But the actual sort of takeaway from this is emails have decreased. So a less important attribute apparently to the consumer, and phone numbers have really stabilized, looking almost flat since the beginning of quarantine. And so in order to do a really stellar job of identifying fraud, identifying risk signals, identifying risk in transactions, is going to be an ability to validate and verify phones. Phones are hard, especially in the EU. You've got GDPR as a really great protection around consumer phone numbers. It can be difficult for companies to sort of get the information they need on their own to say, you know, does this phone actually belong to this person or not? And that's what Ekata does such a great job of, is sort of pulling together that authoritative information in a really safe and compliant way so that you don't have to. So as phone attributes stabilize in North America and Europe, as we see that become the very primary and consistent identifying factor that consumers are sending us, there's sort of four major components to verifying a phone number and assessing the riskiness of a transaction based on the phone number. The first is obvious. You want to check the validity of that phone number. Is this, you know, if they're sending over 22 digits, it's probably not a real phone number, right? These are the logic checks. These are the checks of, you know, does this have a country code with it? Is it in the right format? Is this a phone number that even exists in the world? And a lot of companies can actually do this on their own. It takes a little bit of engineering work, but you can make it happen. It can't stop there, though. That's not enough to get you a really strong signal on whether it's fraud or not. We see a lot of synthetic identity fraud happening right now, where fraudsters sort of make this little Frankenstein identity, pulling a data attribute from this person and from this person and from this person. And so the phone number there is a real phone number. It will validate. It will come back and say this is a real phone number. It's even a phone number with a good reputation score, meaning it's not spammy. It's a consumer phone number, check. And if that's as far as we go on validating a phone number and assessing the risk of a phone number, all of that synthetic identity fraud is going to go through. I'm going to pull out probably less than 1% of fraud with that. So the second step then is sort of looking at these signals and going, does this look like normal behavior? Do we want to increase the friction on this a little bit? This is identifying VoIP versus non-VoIP phones, difference between prepaid and postpaid in terms of risk signals. In Europe and North America, prepaid phones tend to be higher risk. In South America and Southeast Asia, that doesn't necessarily hold true. And so we need to adjust sort of how we view the riskiness of an attribute based on where it's coming from in the region we're in. That can be very, very difficult to do. And Ekata has some incredible signals that allow us to do that at a very high level. The third thing, and this is what's so difficult, this is what is virtually impossible to do from both an engineering perspective, and it's just cost prohibitive, and that is to match the transacting name on that transaction with the actual owner of the phone number. And so when my transaction comes through and it's Noelle Wiggins and it's a phone number, you want to be able to take that transaction and go, is this really Noelle Wiggins' phone number? We can check because we have this authoritative source. We can validate that. Getting those data sets is virtually impossible, right? There's an immense, huge amount of data that you need to have in order to do that. It needs to be authoritative. It needs to be highly vetted. It needs to have a link. You can't just have the phone number. You need to link that to an actual entity. just a shameless plug, because this is my area of expertise and this is my baby at Ekata. In Q4, we have a new data release coming out that is going to include the most phone data we have ever released at one time. That means that your ability to do that matching across the world is going to increase significantly in Europe, in Southeast Asia. We're going to see some really huge benefits to that. So be on the lookout for that. I'm really excited. It's been a year of very hard work to get to that point, because finding this data, finding authoritative, high quality data is really hard. And then on top of that, being compliant with all local laws and regulations is top priority for Ekata. So even when we find that data, oftentimes we choose not to license it because we go, this wasn't sourced right, this doesn't work, this is not compliant. So shameless plug for myself there. Thank you. Number 4, though, and this is also important, in order to really assess the risk of any attribute, you need to observe the behavior of that phone number relative to all other attributes over time. This is, again, engineering prohibitive, cost prohibitive, and just having that volume of data, it doesn't exist anywhere except for Ekata. When I was showing you those transaction volumes early on, and you're seeing those huge peaks and all that going on, that's not even the full transaction volume. I pulled a sample and I pulled a subset to show that to you. We're looking at billions of transactions over time, and can say, hang on a second, this phone number all of a sudden, out of the blue, has been associated with 72 different email addresses. That's not normal behavior. We're going to increase the confidence score on this. That seems like risky behavior. And so even if that phone number is matching with that name, and we go, yes, this, these people are connected, this phone is connected to this owner, you go a step further and you say, yeah, it's connected, but it's performing weirdly, it's behaving weirdly. We've caught this pattern that's indicative of fraud. And that's powerful. When you take all of these things together and you have a phone attribute only, you can do an incredible job of validating that phone number and that name in a transaction coming through at levels that sort of in-house products and in-house data can't do. Phone is a hard one. There's been email has existed as sort of a primary identifying attribute for a lot longer than mobile phone numbers have. And so a lot of places have become very dependent, very reliant on email as that major verifying factor. And what we see is that the importance of phone is so high, which is why that release in Q4 is going to be so critical. It's why our product is so beautifully designed to take a holistic look at a phone number, to take a holistic look at an identity, and then return to you the risk of that, how likely it is to be a risky transaction. With that, I am going to open the floor for a Q&A session. We are at 37 minutes, and I want to thank you profusely for staying with us, for joining for this. I hope it's been helpful. You have a little Q&A section. It should say questions. Please begin submitting your questions. I'm looking forward to answering that. While you do that, we're also going to put a poll up here. I am super passionate about this product. I'm super passionate about how we have done such an incredible job in the market of providing phone as an asset. And then on top of that, email and IP and address and name and all this metadata. If this sounds to you like something that your company could benefit from, if this is something that is going to make Black Friday a really amazing event for you, as opposed to a really high stress event for your manual review agents and for your fraud team, please reach out to us. We would love to contact you. You've got a poll up. It says, yes, contact me right after the webinar. By all means, do that. If you want to be contacted a little later this year, maybe a little closer to Black Friday, we're happy to do that as well. If this isn't the time that you're interested in Ekata solutions, we totally understand. We want to give you this information so that you can make the best decisions for your company and for your product. So take that poll, begin submitting your questions. I'm going to answer those. And because I am at my core a statistician, I, of course, have to go and do a little methodology with you. I always want to make sure that you have the highest confidence in Ekata's data and the data we're presenting to you. So while you submit those questions, while you do that poll, let me just briefly talk to you about how we do our data. So this data was all pulled from a clean hashed database. So there was no identifying information here. It excludes test data and then no logging accounts. Those are the accounts in which we do not observe the transactions coming through. We set very stringent, consistent internal criteria, and all accounts that were sampled had to meet that criteria between January 1st, 2019 and August 31st, 2020. In volume and confidence score analyses, the seasonal cycles were not detrended. This is important because we were actually trying to observe those seasons and some of that seasonality and compare it. However, for volume analysis and then for the time series attribute analysis, we did do a fair amount of smoothing. The volume analysis exponential smoothing was used. And then for the time series attribute analysis, we used moving averages and specifically ARIMA to remove some of that fine-grained variation between the days. So thank you for sticking with us. Absolutely love talking about sort of how we do that, and happy to answer any additional questions about that. We have a couple questions coming through. One question is, will the slides be available? Yes, we will make the slides available. And I don't know if you noticed, but we put all of the citation links in the slides. I don't just include citations just to stick them in there because it's a fun thing to do, but rather because it's very, very important that you go back and you read these. There's some really interesting articles in there that I highly recommend you look for. We've got a comment in who says, great job, really excited about that Q4 data release. Thank you so much. I'm also really excited about the Q4 data release. That level of phone data is sort of unprecedented, not just for Ekata, but across the industry. So you're the first ones hearing about it. You can get excited with me. It's really fun. We have another question that asks, how does Ekata assess the value or importance of a data attribute? This is a great question. So I talked about email and phone specifically today. We assess 5 different data attributes, right? We look at email, we look at phone, we look at IP, we look at shipping address, we look at name, right? And so as far as those are concerned, all of them are equally important and valuable. We only put things on our products that move your ability to assess fraud and make it easier for you to say what is risky, what is not risky. When we get into sort of the more fine-grained details of those items, some of the things that we're looking at, right, are the metadata. We're looking at the network. And so we're trying to decide sort of what is the value of that. First of all, I would so encourage you, if you haven't done a data test with us yet, if you're not using Ekata, contact us, hit that yes, contact me right after the webinar button, because we want to give you an idea of how each of these assets moves your model. Everything is very specific to your use case, very specific to your company, very specific to your goals, what type of fraud you're looking at. On a broader scale, though, we look at AUC as being sort of that primary critical function of how valuable a data asset is. That is area under the curve. What that looks at is how much does this particular asset increase our ability to determine if some given transaction is fraudulent in nature. And we have really, really high standards for that. I gave a shout out earlier. I'll do it again. Our data science team is world-class, extraordinary. They do 2 model releases every year that are just so excellent to move that AUC to make sure that every single data asset that you're sending to us is moving your ability to look at actual fraud and to assess the risk of various transactions and make good decisions accordingly. Thank you for that question. We are almost at 45 minutes, and I want to thank you all for spending the time this morning or this afternoon if you're in Europe with me. We are so passionate at Ekata about providing you the best products and the best information to move your ability to assess risk. And this year's been crazy. It's been stressful. And I think a lot of our fraud teams and merchant risk teams are sort of apprehensive about what Black Friday is going to look like this year, you know, in the new way of being with a global pandemic. And my hope is that what this has done for you today is shown you a little bit of an idea of what we could expect from Black Friday this year, what it might look like. And then on top of that, that there are some incredible solutions that you have in this new day and age to assess fraud and assess risk differently for Black Friday this year, so that your manual review teams aren't overwhelmed, so that your fraud teams aren't stressed out, so that this holiday season can be really effective for you, that you can do business at really incredible levels in this new digital economy. So with that, I want to thank you for joining us. Please always be in touch. We love hearing from you. And after this, I will be sending out a slideshow, a deck of all the questions that we didn't get to during this time and all of that information. So be on the lookout in the next couple of days in your email for that. Thank you again for joining, and have a wonderful rest of your week.